effort, and we also had Scott Murray from the Sources of Strength program. It's been a really interesting model because we've had kind of all facets of folks involved in this, involved in pretty much all of the decision making. And we successfully got it. Colleen, under the next slide, please. So here's some more there's the pictures. So the next one, thanks. What we proposed was a randomized control trial to evaluate the program's Sources of Strength, which is currently an evidence-based youth suicide prevention program. It is on SAMHSA's registry. It has not ever been evaluated for sexual violence outcomes or bullying outcomes. And we cleverly named our study Researching Sexual Violence Prevention Using Resiliency, Strengths, Virality, and Protective Factors. We fondly call it RSVP squared because none of us can remember what that is actually because it's too long. But we and 4 other states were funded to do this work, and all of the other sites are doing very different things. We are currently in 20 high schools across Colorado, and all of the schools are very different. We have very rural schools, we have urban schools, and we are pretty much across all 4 kind of quadrants of the state. So pretty kind of reflective of Colorado, but it's still only 20 schools. We have 11 schools that are currently in the intervention group, which means they're getting the actual sources programming, and 9 schools that are in the control study. And the way it works is the schools are that are in the implementation group are actually entering their 2nd year of implementation. We've collected 3 different data points of data. So we collected data in the fall and spring semester of last year. We finished collection of this fall, and we'll be collecting again next spring. And we are collecting from the control sites as well. They will all the control sites will begin implementing in next fall. So everybody gets 2 years of sources programming as a part of this project. Other slide, Colleen. And so what is Sources of Strength? Sources of Strength is a program that really relies on the power of peer leaders and their social networks to positively change norms and cultures. And this program focuses on training peer leaders. And the really critical piece of this is that peer leaders need to be selected from diverse groups across the school so that you're not getting the same kind of kids who are on student council or in sports represented. You need a broad representation. And teachers are the ones who are assessing, who would be a good fit for this. And so we've been training peer leaders over the last 2 years. And the idea is that they're meeting monthly and they're coming up with social norming messages around help and asking for help and just being a good friend. And our theory around this project, because the thing that is really critical about this study is that we did not adapt Sources of Strength at all from how it was evaluated for suicide outcomes. We really think that these protective factors are as important for sexual violence as for suicide. And additionally, as I alluded to, we're also looking at bullying perpetration and victimization. Because again, we think these are just some root things related to school climate and connecting to one another are really core things to preventing multiple forms of violence, and that's what we're evaluating the program. Yeah. Next slide. So again, this is a visual of sort of how we were seeing all of these things interconnected, that they share risk factors and protective factors. And our theory of change really is that we will see impact across these issues. And we are evaluating, we have different components in our evaluation tool that are addressing all of these things based on those shared protective factors. And again, as I mentioned, we are not adapting this program at all. Next slide, I think you're up, Dorothy, then.
Yeah, so as Tommy was saying, we're in 20 Colorado high schools, approximately 5,000 kids, depending on the wave that you're talking about. There's a number of data sources that we're collecting, largely self-report from the kids with a wide range of both kind of distal and proximal outcomes, as well as intermediate types of things like attitudes towards sexual harassment, actual sexual violence perpetration, help-seeking attitudes, perceptions of staff around intervention, around the wide range of violence measures that we're looking at. We're also collecting friendship nominations. We don't really have a long time to talk about this, but Sources of Strength, one of the mechanisms to bring about change in suicide, and we believe that's going to be the same for sexual violence perpetration, is to have these attitudes that are less dismissive of sexual violence, kind of contaminate through the social networks, and more supportive protective factors. So if we have the kids doing student campaigns to build trusted adults and stronger relationships between all the school members, we would hope that the friendship networks would become more dense, that there would be less isolated kids in the intervention schools. In addition to that, because this is much more different than a canned prevention program, we're collecting a lot, well, Tommy's team is collecting a lot of information around what does the implementation look like. Because you can imagine that as this is really peer-led, that the 11 schools have 11 different types of implementation. So we're trying to be really cognizant to understand that it really may be, like in many of our studies, an implementation story. Implementation may vary, and so we're collecting the number of peer leaders trained, the number of meetings they have, the different types of campaigns, to see what that implementation looks like. And so those are the kind of the data sources that we have. As Tommy said, her team has done a wonderful job. Got to recognize that they were not school-based researchers. They're well-trained now in data collection. So if you ever need them to do that, they know exactly how to go in and get parent consent and make sure that we have high participation rates, which we do, of 80 to like 80%. It's pretty impressive. And so we have 3 waves of data. The 3rd wave is still being processed. The 4th wave will be collected in the spring. Sources of strength really is evidence-based for suicidal ideation and not necessarily behaviors, but where they got the largest effects was where you had 2 years of implementation. So let's go to the next slide, Colleen. Let's see what that looks like. And there's your map, Tommy. So these are where all the schools are located. So there was lots of driving going on for Tommy's team and seeing the beautiful state of Colorado. Okay, you can switch there. You can change it, Colin. What's also interesting about the sample is that 40% of the sample is Latinx, so we'll be able to look at the extent to which sources of strength works within the context of largely Caucasian population, but also the Latinx youth, which will be a major contribution given the risk factors in that population. So as we said before, Sources of Strength is on NREP program, and it has shown to increase connections in adults, increase school engagement, increase referrals to suicidal friends, positive perceptions of adult support, increasing the acceptability of help seeking, so making that somewhat normative over time. And so we wanted to see if this extended to sexual violence, as Tommy, her team, and the work that I've done over the last few decades is really clearly pointing to an overlapping risk and protective factors associated with sexual violence. Okay, next slide, Colleen. Let's see what we got next. Okay, so one component, I'm just going to show you year 1 preliminary kind of results that we're going to make sure that it plays out with all the fancy statistics that our analysts are doing. What I'm showing you here, though, this is a paper that Tommy and I are writing up with our team now, and this is just looking at the kids' perceptions of staffs on the left side. Here we controlled for the extent to which being male or female predicts sexual violence, victimization, and perpetration. And as you can see, higher males are more likely, females are more likely to be victimized, boys are more likely to be the perpetrators. What I want you to pay attention to here is these are the kids' perceptions of the staff intervening around violence and sexual violence. When the kids perceive that the staff are intervening, they're victimized less. However, that does not predict perpetration. So it does seem to protect around victimization, but not perpetration. But this is only at wave 1. So we'll be able to look at these trajectories over time across the 4 waves to see how that changes at the individual student level as well as the school level. But here, as those high help-seeking behaviors around sexual violence was related to less victimization and related to less perpetration. So help-seeking seems to be a critical variable, which is great because that is a huge part of the sources of strength. So in some ways, this is a cross-sexual validation that we do have those protective factors operating at least at wave 1. Because if we didn't have those associations, we'd be concerned. Also, and this replicates much of my research, as kids are dismissive of sexual violence, they're more likely to be victimized and they're more likely to perpetrate. So this just kind of gives us some sense that these constructs of interest that we drew from our logic model of sources of strength is playing out. Colleen, the next slide. So with wave 1 and wave 2 here, what you're seeing is we have a treatment variable predicting wave 2, controlling for wave 1. And these are the old ones, Tommy, unfortunately. Oops. Okay, so we want to flip through that, Colleen.
Yeah.
Yeah, because those aren't the right ones. And that's not the right one either.
I can, Tommy, can you pull up, I have uploaded let's see if I can do.
Okay. I mean, I could talk you through it too. I can pull it up.
Yeah, Tommy, would you mind sharing the ones that Dorothy sent? Because I'm pretty sure I plugged in your new email, so I don't know if the same ones got sent to me.
Sorry about that. I just don't want to show you the wrong ones.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And it should be the one, Tommy, where there's 3 figures. And if we don't get it pulled up, I can talk us through it. What do you think, Tommy? You want to try?
Working on it, but why don't you start talking? And we'll...
Okay, so what I'm going to show you is, so we have wave 1 and wave 2, which is just the 1 year of implementation, comparing the 11 schools to the 9 control schools. Remember, this is a randomized clinical trial, so what I'm showing you isn't necessarily taking in the nesting of the school, and certainly we want to do that. Once you see this, there's a figure 1. You all can imagine, use your imaginary skills here. And looking at the extent to which treatment reduced sexual violence perpetration at wave 2, controlling for sexual violence perpetration at wave 1. And unlike the slides that you're looking at, the ones, if you could look at it, we show a direct effect from treatment. If you're in a sources of strength school, you are less likely to perpetrate sexual violence at wave 2, controlling for your individual propensity at wave 1, right? So we have a direct effect, which is important. And we're going in to look at some mediation, but at this point, we have reduced sexual violence perpetration with sources of strength after 1 year of treatment, and that explains about 12% of the variance in sexual violence perpetration. Should I keep going, Tommy? We're good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, and then the second figure, you can imagine we're predicting cyber sexual perpetration. Again, we find a direct effect that if you're in a sources of strength school compared to a control school, you are less likely to report cyber sexual perpetration at wave 2, controlling for wave 1. So that's figure 2. So to recap, we have reduced sexual violence perpetration, both face-to-face and online behaviors, after 1 year of sources of strength compared to those kids that did not receive sources of strength training. The third, which is very, very important, is we have reduced dismissiveness of sexual harassment. If, in fact, you're in a sources of strength school, which we know in high schools in this country, both boys and girls are quite dismissive of sexual harassment, largely because the adults aren't talking to them about this, so they don't really see it as sexual harassment. We have reduced that dismissiveness after 1 year, controlling for their individual propensity, what they kind of brought to the table at wave 1. Look at that. That's great. Thanks, Tommy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So Colleen, can you go back?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So we did that. Go ahead, Colleen. Yep. All right. So here, what you see is just look right at the treatment effect to sexual violence perpetration. There we have, and it explains 12% of the variance. And so keep going. And then we have the SV victimization, the cyber victimization perpetration. Yeah, I meant perpetration. Gosh. Okay. Okay. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So at this point, we're very excited to share these results. Certainly we have to probe some of these findings further with our analyst. But at this point, after 1 year, we're hoping to sustain these gains across these 2 years, because as you imagine, the second year of implementation of any program, there's some slippage. And so we're working with our schools to maintain a high level of implementation, and where they're having issues, we're bringing in further support, because this is such an organic program and not, structured and standardized. Tommy's team's working very, very closely, as well as the Sources of Strength team, to support these schools and moving forward. We will have wave 3 cleaned up this fall. And then Tommy, they'll do their magic for wave 4 in the spring. And we are already starting to process the friendship networks, because what we'll want to do is to take these kind of basic direct effects and map those on to understand them onto the networks, to understand the mechanisms. And what we'll have is over time for each of the sources of strength schools, we'll be able to look at how the network structures changed over time, not just in composition, but really related to dismissiveness around sexual violence. And then most importantly, where are our sexual violence perpetrators situated within that network? And if there's a drop off of those perpetration, what is the mechanism by which that is happening, whether it's help seeking within the friendship or it's number of trusted adults that they have to go to. So I'll just stop there, and I'm sorry for the confusion. Part of it, I'll take responsibility because I'm an Australian. It's Tuesday. So so I apologize. Usually I'm not this like, woo. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Does anybody have any questions for Dorothy and Tommy about the project and study and results?
That's been happening here in Australia too. So I'm just thinking that I'm just perfectly clear.
I think someone's trying to talk, maybe.
Kimberly?
One question I have, and maybe I should know the answer because I work with Tommy, but is the plan, like, depending on what's learned in the study, is there any sort of plan to rethink about how sources of strength is implemented in schools, or is there's like a certain area of focus over something else that tends to be working better, like the help seeking within the friend groups or the connection to the adults or something else?
Go ahead, Dorothy.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation with the sources team to think about, there's a lot of conversations about looking closely at the implementation data and the issues with sustaining implementation at a level. I don't know what else you would say, Tommy, because I
think, as Dorothy alluded to, that Sources is a very flexible, atypical evidence-based program. It doesn't have like fidelity requirements, for example, and we were pretty intentional in leveraging Peter Wyman's previous study. He had previously examined sources of strength to put in some basic criteria for, how long peer leaders should be meeting, how often, that kind of stuff. And our hope is to help give some shape to that programming so that when you're going to a school, that they are very clear about expectations. With any school program, it's difficult to sustain this work if it isn't sort of systematized in a meaningful way. And so we've definitely had challenges with implementation in terms of people not meeting our idea of what fidelity looks like, and it's not really typically how Sources thinks about their programming, but we're hoping that we can learn more about, what is the minimum that we need to meet to actually see this impact.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in my previous trials, we've used some really innovative meta-analytic strategies with implementation data to point to, and then what you do is you look at implementation variables and then you map that onto your outcomes, and it does give you an indication of where are you going to get the strongest effect. So in one of our social emotional learning trials, we found that when teachers prepared a lesson together, when they embrace the social emotional learning program as an academic kind of math, reading, and science, that the effect sizes for all forms of violence, including sexual violence, were kind of through the roof. But if they weren't doing that, there's other things of spending their own money, doing more of the lesson. Now this is different, but I think that we have enough implementation data that we might be able to do a very similar meta-analysis to at least have some guidance for schools of like, if you want to get these reductions in sexual violence, this is a good implementation model. So I think that'll be exciting. It's very messy implementation data. But, I think that we have, and I think Tommy knows that you can identify in the schools where they're kind of rocking out sources. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What other questions do folks have for Dorothy and Tommy while we have them on the phone? And if there are no specific questions, I actually have some questions for the group just to elicit some conversation and discussion. And so hopefully you can see my screen here. But I'm curious, how can, what's learned from this research study be applied to the work that you all do in your states or in your programs? I think especially those of you who work on RPE and sexual violence, I'd be curious to hear from you as well. Very quiet group. Or we can jump to any of the other questions. So what type of partnerships do you have with researchers in your work? Are you engaged in research studies similar to this partnership that Colorado has with University of Florida and the University of Rochester? I also welcome any kind of participation from our CDC partners too, since you might know what other states are working on for these types of projects as well.
Hi, this is Kimberly, and I'm the project officer and new to this actual region. So just wanted to say hello and introduce myself. But thank you for the presentation. And actually, this is some great things. I'm a project officer for Utah, as well as Ohio for ChorusFIP. And actually, we've had some of these discussions previously with Utah, particularly wanting to look at some of this perpetration and idolation. And they were more interested in a corporal punishment type of aspect. But I think that this information was definitely helpful and something that I feel like I can point to them. Received a lot of feedback from some of our SMEs and the DVP here at CDC around some of these same issues. So thank you for that, and just being an additional resource for states that have interest in these topics.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. I know that Utah is usually able to join, so unfortunately, they couldn't today.
Right.
And then Allison Trainer just said, great presentation. I'm sorry, my microphone is not working appropriately. Sources of Strength is a great program, so this is very exciting. Are there other thoughts around how this kind of work, information that you could share with the larger group if you are also working to apply shared risk and protective factor approaches in your work, and what that looks like? How it might differ from this?
Sure. I think that one of the great things about this research and about Sources of Strength is that it allows us to talk about our work by talking about our shared strategies, and which is one of our big focuses right now, instead of talking just about the outcomes that programs like Sources of Strength impact, so that we can really frame the conversation around impacting a multitude of issues at once, and leveraging resources in that way. So that's something that Colorado is thinking a lot about, and I feel like this presentation just highlights how much great work there is to share around that.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, well, I'm not going to make us sit in awkward silence for too long. So,
Allie, can I just jump in on one thing?
Sure.
As far as like partnership with researchers?
Yeah, I would love that.
And I had to step out for a quick second, so I may have missed this, but as the with the emergence of vape products, like e-cigs and things like that, continuing to look at what we know should work theoretically because of the shared risk factor approach, but people always want more outcomes. And so I think in general, that's just been something that keeps coming up as people think about new outcomes or emerging outcomes, of constantly looking back at the work we're already doing to leverage. And that research partnership, I think, is always really important in that way, to be responsive when I know it's really hard to do when you're a few years into RCTs.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. Well, are there any other final thoughts or kind of application to your work that this may be applied to?
This is Mallory from North Dakota. I'll just be interested in seeing the research when it's done, because in North Dakota, we are doing Green Dot with our RPE funding, but with our suicide prevention funding, they're funding a lot of sources of strength in the schools. And so we haven't really looked at it as a shared risk and protective factor approach. We should, but it will just be good to see the results and how we could better coordinate our efforts.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
your point.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share any language that's helpful especially for RPE, specifically around like how do you frame your budget or your work plan to justify, because like I said, we paid for sources of strength. I think it was like 5 years ago was like the first time we did it. So CDC is definitely amenable to it and happy to share our lessons learned related to that.
I'm
Well,
wondering.
one of the things that we're learning is like, you know, if we can then say that it works for e-cigs too, can we use a little bit of tobacco's extra money? Or can we, if we know it should work for opioids, can we use it for any opioid money that's coming out? So kind of how to spread some of the costs across a bunch of different programs when something feels like a huge chunk of one budget might actually be a really small portion of someone else's budget that they're willing to chip in.
Yep. And I think that's the point that I didn't really fully flesh out when I was talking, but Allie oversees the marijuana program, and we're actually using marijuana prevention funding to pay for sources of strength because it's within their menu of strategies for communities that care. We're also leveraging Office of Suicide Prevention to train the trainers. We're leveraging pretty much everybody in our branch to help with data collection. So there's a lot of resources that have been dedicated to this that are not strictly focused on either sexual violence or suicide.
What are do you have specific plans on how to disseminate the research results as they come in, besides doing like presentations like this, so that we can make sure to share that with this group going forward?
Well, Dorothy's a publishing machine. Dorothy, do you want to talk about some of your publications that you have coming out?
Yeah, absolutely. So my team publishes quite a bit, and we try to get this information out. But we also, beyond peer-reviewed articles, we try to do webinars like this, but at a large scale, working with CDC to do this or other like Prevent Connect. Also, I would see some fact sheets going out to nonprofits and other folks across the country. So we try to disseminate widely. We're not naive to think that people read our journal articles. And so we have, and we're looking at other subgroups within the data set too. So we have a paper under review looking at suicide and sexual violence, perpetration and victimization among LGBT youth. We're looking at school climate, because we also do have school climate data from the teachers and the adults in the building. So we're doing some multi-level modeling to look at kind of individual characteristics interacting with the school. So we don't do research just for the sake of research. We do research to translate that into practice in the field. And I think that there is a real thirst for this type of information, because as much as Green Dot, shows some promise, the effects for many of the programs that even our federal government are promoting, like Dating Matters and Green Dot and Shifting Boundaries, there's questions about the sustainability. And so, if we can find a program that doesn't necessarily have to speak to sexual violence directly, that would be awesome, given the conservative nature and the political context that we're working in. So we feel an urgency to make sure that we're not sitting on these data for years like many researchers do.
Okay, thanks. And I would also say that Tommy, as that information comes out, we're happy to share that with this network. One of the purposes of the Plains Peaks regional network and just the RNCOs in general is to help strengthen that relationship between research and practice. And so, so we'd be happy to share that information as it comes out. And then for all of you who are members of the network, if you partner with researchers in your own states or within your own work, we'd love to highlight that work as well.
Great, thank you.
Sally, were you gonna say anything? I saw you came off mute, so I wasn't sure.
No, I was just going to who's our favorite kind of researcher.
Okay.
Hi, this is Sheza here, Sheza speaking.
Hi.
The new fellow with DARPy. And I was just wondering, how are you measuring the reduction of cyber sexual bullying? How is that measured?
Yeah, so for those items, and we can send you and share our survey if you'd like. So we wanted to map those questions on as much as possible to the YRBS measures. But I think we ended up going with the Ybarra measure. So I can certainly share that measure with you. So it depends on how we were phrasing it, but I can certainly send that to you.
Okay, thank you. And did that also involve like parsing through people's social media sites to the student sites or anything like that? Or was this self-reported data?
Yeah, it's all self-report data. We have 5,000 kids, so.
Oh, wow,
yeah. So unlike Michelle Ybarra's studies where she was growing up with media, where she like drills deep down into where this is happening, we were only able to do a really basic self-report. But every measure that we've used has really, really strong reliability. So and the convergence looks good. We're happy with the measurement. When you're surveying 5,000 kids across 20 schools and doing friendship nominations and trusted adult nominations, we had to be and we wanted to get in and out. We didn't want to burden the kids so that we had fatigue and then have compromised data. So we've had to make some tough decisions about measurement.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Espelage.
You're welcome. You call me Dorothy.
Oh, thanks, Dorothy.
There's also a follow-up question related to that. And so Allison asked, I think she's asking to also see the survey if possible. And if you send that to me, Tommy or Dorothy, I can send that out to the group.
Yep.
Yep.
But there's also a question around whether students are surveyed electronically. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about the methodology.
Yeah. So we used REDCap in this study, and there's been a few technological issues. So there's been some paper surveys, but minimal in comparison to the majority of it. I would say probably 4,800 have been collected through REDCap, which has been nice because of the longitudinal nature of the data, and it also allowed us to de-identify the data immediately. So, because this is very sensitive data, as you can imagine, right? So we have rape items and suicide items. So our broker is in Rochester, so we don't have identifying information, and that was important for our IRB to allow us to use a waiver in this context, which we're very grateful for. So.
Yeah, and each school has a unique link that so when we go into the school, there's just a link and students either log in or it's already set up as an icon on their laptop or Chromebook. Even some schools have gone as far as having students just use their phones. It's been very easy, actually.
Mm-hmm. And we've translated the survey into Spanish and Braille. That's right, and Braille. So that was good.
Thanks. Are there any other final questions for Dorothy and Tommy while we have them? Okay, well, a huge thank you to both of you for offering to present on a learning opportunity today, especially from Australia. So thanks so much, Dorothy. And we're looking forward to hearing, future results and where the study takes us over the next year or so.
Great.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Just quickly for the rest of the group, a couple things about wrap up. Our next learning opportunity is January 23rd from 1 to 2 Mountain Standard Time and 2 to 3 Central Time. And so I was hoping to do a little poll around if there's anything you'd like to cover on future learning opportunities, but realized that the poll only gives you multiple choice options, and I wanted this to be more open-ended. So if there's anything that you're hoping to cover on future learning opportunities, would love to hear it. I know that Allie actually had offered to facilitate something related to legislative sessions, since that'll be the start or at least the first month for legislative sessions for a lot of us in our state. So we can talk about it internally, but if there's anything you would like to know specifically, please feel free to let me know, and we can run that by our advisory team. Or anything off the top of people's heads now that they'd like to discuss? to learn about. We have a very quiet group today. Okay, well, then we will go forward with some ideas that the advisory team has come up with, but if there's anything that comes up more urgently that we want to cover in January, we're happy to do that. And as a reminder, we switched to an every other month schedule, so we'll come together again in 2 months. But thank you everybody for joining today, and we will reconvene in a couple months.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.